What you are about to witness is a fascinating interview with a gentleman called Christopher Spencer, or rather that is his pen name. He has to conceal his real name. In the following interview, Christopher speaks about his 50 plus years in the world of high-level finance, both as a banker and a finance and investment broker. He covers everything from international espionage to covert financial agreements, conmen, murder, war, and more, with a touch of personal flair. Everything you are about to hear is true. Some questions were pre-agreed and scripted to explain specific content in his books. Most are not. You can find details of where to buy his books in the video description below. This is part 11.
Well, I started in banking in the early 1960s, and in those days, banking was completely different. I mean, you had your local bank manager, you had your local bank branch, and the bank manager was a god within that branch. I was a junior clerk. My first job in banking was to change the nibs on the pens, and we just had ordinary pens in those days, fill the inkwells, change the blotting paper. And on Saturday mornings, because we used to open it up on Saturday mornings in those days, it was a 5.5-day week, my job was to stoke the boiler, because the caretaker used to have the weekend off, and yours truly had to get his jacket off, put his tie inside his shirt, open the boiler with a big shovel, you had a lever to open it, and then stoke the coal into the boiler and close the door again and watch out that the sparks didn't burn my shirt. That was my junior clerk's job, and then gradually I became just a junior clerk through various machines we had to use and adding up. Then I became a cashier, and in those days you didn't have any calculator to add these items up. You had a long sheet with about 90 items on them, and you had to work. You had to add it all up in your head. There were no calculators or anything like that. Then slowly, as I progressed taking my banking exams, I got more and more responsible jobs given to me, until eventually I was the person responsible for taking mortgages over people's houses, for buying their stocks and shares, buying and selling their foreign currency that they needed, taking mortgages over their homes if they were having a loan, doing their tax returns if the customers wanted that, looking after their valuables in the strong room. I mean, banks no longer offer any of those kind of services. It's now a very simple, you go to the hole in the wall and take your money out. And if you've got to go into a bank, well, there's one cashier there, and you have to queue for half an hour to be actually served by them. In those days, you went into a bank and you were served immediately, or almost immediately, because more cashiers were put on to service the customers that were coming in. It was a much more friendly, people-orientated situation. Now banks are nothing more or less than retail shops. They're all like at the KFC, you just go in and grab your food or grab whatever you want as quickly as possible, and then you're out. I mean, I worked in a couple of merchant banks. As I've mentioned, most of them, the people there, they had gone to a public fee-paying school. They'd been to Oxford and Cambridge. In fact, one banker that I worked with, they'd only changed their policy. They only allowed two public schools to produce candidates for them, and 2 universities, either Eton or Harrow or Oxford and Cambridge. And you had to go to one of those to be able to even work for the bank. Here I was, a grammar school boy that had gone to an ordinary college of London University, and I found myself sitting with people who usually had titles of one kind or another, very, very charming people, who didn't have to work for a living. They just did it because they wanted to do something. And it was obviously a different world. I worked with one guy who was the son of a head of a Scottish clan, charming individual, very, very modest person. I remember the story well of how one day I heard him go to our manager, who was sitting behind me, and he said, "Can I have an extra hour for lunch today, do you think?" And our manager said to him, "Yes, are you going somewhere nice?" And this chap lowered his voice so nobody else could hear, or he thought nobody else could hear what he was saying. And he said, "Well, actually, I'm going for a private lunch with the Queen at Buckingham Palace." And our manager kind of paused and said, "Well, take as much time as you like." And when he got back, I looked at him and smiled, and I said, "I heard where you were going for lunch." And he said, "Yes." He said, I said, "How did it go?" And he said, "She was lovely." He meant Her Majesty, of course. She told me to sit by her and talk to me all the way through lunch. And the only people that were there with us were Charles and Anne. So that was the kind of people. They were modest. They were not egotistical. They weren't boasting. Even though they'd had the best education that money could buy and been to the best universities that money could buy as well.
That's really interesting that you say that, because the very large majority of people you've ever told me about in these stories, and the ones we can't say publicly, the very large majority, at least 90% of them, you always say were actually really nice, calm, collected, charming, and modest, which absolutely flies in the face of what we're taught, where I come from, about those kind of people.
Yeah.
Now, even I am surprised, and I actually think highly to an extent of those kind of people compared to my peers, because I'm a little bit more educated on the difference in the cultures and everything. And when I listen to your descriptions of those people compared to my people, as it were, it seems like it's completely the wrong way around, because my people think they're great and the people you're talking about are bad, horrible people. But it actually sounds like the people you're talking about are the great ones, and my ones are the bad, horrible people. That's very interesting to hear from my point of view. But then, bearing that in mind, what would you say about the difference between that contingent that you're used to and the others, like the idiots, for example, that end up on the bad side, like the ones who take advantage of their position corporate-wise, and then people like Boris Johnson, for example, who I would not say is modest or charming. Well, I suppose he's charming to an extent, or he wouldn't have got where he was. Well, what would you say to that kind of element of those kind of people, the culture that they live in?
I mean, you find what they call the nouveau riche. I think these are the families that haven't had hundreds of years of estates and money. The nouveau riche, of course, have got to be nouveau riche by using their elbows, using their shoulders, being provocative, etc., etc. And these nouveau riche people are usually the more unpleasant people. They're the ones that cut corners. They're the ones that try and pull the veil over people's eyes. They're the ones that have an ego which is gigantic and look down on people. I found that the so-called ruling classes, the people with the money, the aristocracy, if you like, of older times, are much nicer than these people. Once you have this background, then you don't need to prove anything anymore. You don't need to be nasty to people. You don't need to use your elbows against other people because you're there already. This is almost like an argument for the monarchy, in many ways, because in the end, if you're brought up with this kind of life and you're genuinely interested in people, it is a very genuine situation. And I think His Majesty King Charles is that kind of person. In fact, in many ways, he's been the harbinger and the prophet because for years he's been talking about the green situation, the environment, etc. And now I think a lot of young people realise that he was a prophet. He was a man that people turned around and said, look, this man's mad. He's Prince of Wales, he's completely mad because of what he's saying. But now people realise it was actually the truth. And this was a very wise man. And he realised that this is the problem that we were now going to face. Sorry, put in the word for the king there. But it is true. I was talking to somebody the other day about this.
Would you like to elaborate?
Sorry?
Would you like to elaborate?
No, not on that.
Okay, moving on.
Yes, the aristocratic situation in the UK is interesting. I mean, one of the favourite programmes that many people watch is Downton Abbey, for example. People are fascinated by the life of the old aristocracy, can we call it? I think the situation is now changing among some people. They kind of don't like the aristocracy. They think that they stolen their money. They have a contempt for the lower classes. That isn't true of the real aristocracy, by the way, not the ones that I've met. They have a sense of duty to the rest of the population. They made their money. They don't need to steal, beg, borrow, fraud, or anything else. They don't need any more money because they've got it. And they are properly educated, and they really have the idea that in many ways people are equal, and they're prepared to talk to anybody of any class or description in order to be really interested in them. People have these days this idea of a new aristocracy, of course, the aristocracy of the pop star, of the celebrity, etc. But of course, a lot of these people are people that have used their elbows, quite rightly, to get to the top. And they tend to be a bit brash, they tend to waste their money, they tend to do stupid things in many ways. But these are the people that the mass of the population looked up to. I think the mass of the population need to look up more and say, yeah, this person is good, well educated. Yes, they've carried out this tremendous work in science to bring a new drug, to bring a vaccine against COVID. Those are the people that should be respected and really celebrated in our society, rather than the pop stars and the mass celebrity process.